Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. When we think of the Western Front, we think of the trenches of mud, gunfire and death. But there was another side to the war, the quieter spaces just behind the lines. In this episode, we explore life in those rear areas, the routines, the rest, the brief moments of humanity, and some of the choices men made in the face of exhaustion and uncertainty. Well, hello Dan, pleasure to be joining you on the podcast as always, and this is a little bit of a special podcast episode because this is an episode that was actually chosen by our subscribers over on the Dugout, our Fourth Wall site. We have a number of polls running there to decide who's going to, or what subject I should say, is going to be next for our podcast discussion. And in a very, very tight race, Life Behind the Lines was chosen. And it's a great subject, I'm sure you'll agree.
It is really interesting subject, and actually it was a tight race, and I'm quite glad that actually it was this one that won, because the other option, if I remember, was life in neutral Netherlands in the post-war during the war years, which is fascinating, but I know absolutely nothing about. So I'm glad that we at least do something more of a home match this time. But you're right, you know, this is I think it's one of those. It's a classic old phrase, really. It's a slightly understudied area of life on the Western Front. But what's really interesting about it is if you were to go back and look at, for example, veteran accounts of the Great War from things like the Imperial War Museum, it has an amazing archive of hundreds, if not thousands of accounts of Great War veterans. The vast majority of the time, they're talking about their experiences in the war. They're not talking about being on the front lines. They're talking about what they got up to behind the front lines. And that, I think, gives a little bit of a clue about the importance of life in the rear areas and what it meant to people who were, in essence, young men, spending time in a foreign country, typically surrounded by their mates. It was a big deal.
It was. And something that I think that's really easy to forget is that most soldiers would spend more time in the rear areas than they actually would in the front line. And with exceptions, of course, periods of intense battle and certain campaigns where the all hands are to the front effectively. I'm thinking about things like Verdun or the German Spring Offensives, which greatly disrupts life behind the lines as soldiers pour to the front. But for large portions of the war, the majority of the war on the Western Front, you as a soldier would spend more time in the rear areas than you would in the front lines themselves. And this was because all armies, certainly by the middle stage of the war, were operating a rotation system where soldiers generally did relatively short stints in the front line unless there was a major battle in progress. And it varied a great deal. It varied by weather condition, it varied by front, it varied by other factors such as what reserves were available. But generally, a stint in the front line could be as little as 4 days for British soldiers, up to perhaps 2 weeks at the most. Average length of time that you might spend in the trench, well, it varies by nationality and period of the war, but you're generally looking around about a week, maybe just over a week, depending on the time. And then once you've completed your time in the front line, so a relatively short period, though a very harrowing and tiring one, you then rotate out to your reserve support lines, where you spend some more time close to the front line, and then you'll rotate out to the rear areas, and you'll spend a lot of time in and around those rear areas. And I think it's worth actually establishing here, Dan, about, well, when we talk about this, it's a phrase that's used all the time in the First World War. It's a phrase that's still used in military terminology today. What do we actually mean by the rear area of the Western Front?
It's a good point, actually. And I think in a very broad sense, if you can imagine that classic strip or swathe of land cutting its way through Belgium, northern France, and then eventually across to the Swiss border, you can imagine that kind of section of front line with no man's land in the center, and then a ever-growing network of trenches behind it. What you could also do is draw another strip of land directly behind each of those lines, and that is the respective army's rear area. And we're talking typically, and again, this varies depending on geography and various other factors, but within about 5 to 10 miles of a frontline position. And we find that these typically, at least in the British sector, is populated by often small villages, which were obviously existent there pre-war. And so they've got a little bit of infrastructure related to them. There's obviously medical facilities. There's a lot of supplies coming up and moving back. But quite often you also find actually large towns. And those large towns have remained inhabited really throughout the war. Depending on which part of the line you are, taking the British sector, for example, perhaps the most famous in the northern part of the British line is the town of Popperinga, or Pop, which is about probably 5 miles back from Ypres town itself. And it's a classic rest and recuperation area. It's got all of the kind of usual things you'd expect to find in a pre-war Belgian town, which, as we get into this episode, we'll discuss, change greatly as the war goes on to cater for the needs of the soldiers that are coming through there on a regular basis. But other towns as well, you find them back behind the lines, Hazebrook being another one, which is a big rail hub, but also another classic rear area town. And places like Bethune. Bethune's a really big one, particularly in 1915. It's a big pre-existing town. It's got lots of infrastructure. It's got places where you can house troops as well, which is very important and actually dictates a lot of what goes on in the rear areas. But also you can go in there and get a hot meal. You can go and watch a play. You can go and do some kind of recreational activity. So there's huge amounts going on. But really, rear areas in that sense, we're talking about that strip of land about 5 to 10 miles behind the front lines. And as you rightly say, Spence, these will be the areas that those troops that spend their time out on the Western Front will remember far better than the others. And there's another quick point to make here, actually, as well. Quite often when we talk about, these soldiers saying, well, what was it like on Vimy Ridge? What was it like on the Somme? What was it like in Ypres? Quite often what they're referring to is when soldiers describe these things is not necessarily those frontline positions, but rather the areas behind them. Quite simply, you're not sticking your head over the top and looking out towards the enemy lines very often. But you are walking around the shops in Bethune on one of those rare days off. So, there's all kinds of things to consider. But we should also remember at the same time, rear areas do not mean safe areas.
Absolutely, they don't. And although 5 miles you're at the extreme range of heavy artillery here, there are guns that can reach that far, super heavies. And even if you're not being hit by artillery shells, overshots or long distance shots, you can still hear the guns. The crunch of guns, the thump of guns is very audible within 5 miles from the front. And air raids are also a problem, a growing problem actually, really through 1916, 17 and 18, as nighttime bombing becomes, not exactly comes of age, but is used more and more by both sides actually to try and deliberately disrupt rear areas and cause confusion and panic and so forth. You're also very conscious of how close you are to the front line because of the sounds of shooting, shell fire, the rattle of machine guns can be heard and so forth. You might witness casualties being brought back. And this is even during periods where there isn't intense fighting. There's just been an exchange of fire. Unfortunately, some people have been hit and they're being evacuated out. So what it creates is this slightly, I suppose, a dissonance really, in that one sense you are obviously in a civilian area. It is an undamaged or only perhaps lightly damaged town. There are farms nearby. People are going about their daily business. Civilians are trying to live their life much as they did before the First World War. And yet at the same time, it is clearly a very anomalous situation because these towns are filled with uniformed personnel, whether they're military soldiers or whether they're nurses or female auxiliaries or so forth. Clearly, this is very odd. And on top of this, you are very aware the front line is close by. There is the battle sounds and so forth. And so it creates this slightly surreal world in some respects, which is noted by soldiers at the time, that it feels and it looks like civilian life, but it isn't quite civilian life. And one thing that's quite interesting, of course, as you said, Dan, is that there's thousands and thousands of civilians living very close to the front line. And they are doing their absolute best to try and live the best lives they can. So life goes on in these towns. The farmers till their fields, the children go to school, people attend church services and so on. But at the same time, it's like an entirely new population, which is, there's no exaggeration, has somehow descended upon your town too. And for French towns who are experiencing this with French soldiers, of course, the experience is a little different. There's a shared culture, there's a shared language. It is not without its difficulties and pressures, But it's very different to the experience of French towns that are being filled with British, Canadian, Australian, American, or even on the other side of the line, filled with German soldiers as well. And the cultural differences, the cultural interactions actually behind the lines are probably a lot more acute and noticeable than we would have in the 21st century in a more globalized world. In 1914 to 18, very few Britons leave the country except to go to other parts of the empire, the English speaking world, the Anglosphere. To actually go to France, even though it's only across the English Channel, is a bit like going to the other side of the moon for most common British soldiers. And by the same token, most Belgians and most French will not have ever encountered a Briton. Maybe one or two well-to-do tourists who will have passed through, but Tommies, absolutely not. And so it creates all sorts of culture clashes as well. And you can imagine, Dan, that on one hand, as a young soldier, it's a great adventure. You know, you've never seen anything like this before. This is very different. And yet, on the other hand, you've also got to respect and try and work with the locals as well, with cultural differences, with language barriers, and also with the shadow of military discipline too. So it creates some interesting tensions, I think.
It does, and actually, as you were describing that just there, I was thinking back to one of my prized possessions, if you like, and it's a soldier's phrase book which was given to a young lad by the name of Ted Ambrose by his mother on the eve of going away to war, and it was every phrase that a British soldier needs in order to get by in a town in France, and it's totally there's no way that it's directed at the front line. It's absolutely directed at being used in the rear areas. And you open it up and it gives you not only the French wording for, you know, where can I buy a chicken, it also gives you the phonetics as well. So it breaks it down in really simple language. This is the kind of noise you have to make in order to form that word. So it's very, very interesting. But it gives you that little window into the life of what these guys are experiencing. I think there's some real charm about that. But it does also drop hints about language barriers and these kind of problems, as you say. And inevitably, there are issues that are associated with this. You get not every 18-year-old British lad that's going out is a well-behaved young man that's heading out to the Western Front. Famously, there's a story in the Hertfordshire Regiment ranks, the regiment I follow most closely, of a guy going into a shop trying to buy a chicken. In fact, it's in his stamina. We'll come on to that in a moment. He wants to buy a chicken so that he and his mates can eat it. And he's outraged because the last people in that same place were Canadian troops who are paid significantly higher. The French locals get word of the Canadians being in the area and say, right, let's boost the prices up a bit. Next week, poor old Brits come in who get paid nowhere near the same amount. And all of a sudden, this chicken's out of cost. You know, they just can't afford it. So that evening, a couple of lads go into the back garden of this lady's estaminet, nick a chicken, kill it, get it floured by the quartermaster and take it back to her the next day and ask if she'll cook it for them for a much lower price, which she does, not realizing, of course, it's her own chicken that's been stolen the night before. So, you know, you get all of these funny little things that go on, and I think they're really quite charming when you look back at that kind of thing. But we should also remember, and you made, I think, a really valid point here. When you say filled with British soldiers, we do mean that certain towns and particularly villages are absolutely bursting at the seams. Popperinger's permanent, if you like, permanent residency is something like a tenth of what it becomes throughout the entire 4 years of the Great War. At any given time, the population has been expanded tenfold by visiting troops. And so all of those logistics are under strain, the civilian logistics, you know, if you want to get into a bar, if you want to go into get your watch repaired, all of that kind of thing. You know, this is all really difficult to do. But it also at the same time, and this is, I think, something that's really important, creates a lot of opportunity, particularly for entrepreneurial locals who can open any number of enterprises to try and make the most of this increased population.
It's a really good point. And just as you were saying that, I was reminded of the fact that once it becomes clear the Western Front is largely static and it's not going to move anytime soon, there's actually a certain degree of movement away from rear areas where civilians live. Now, partially this is because they're fearful that, well, the front might move, the Germans might lunge at us and we'll be overrun, so that a lot of civilians move. There's also some civilians who move away because they don't like the number of soldiers, that they are causing disruption, particularly if you've got daughters of marriageable age. There's a real concern about their safety and their morality. So you read about quite a number of families will move away from the rear areas. But what's perhaps equally fascinating is people move into the rear areas to do exactly what you've just described, Dan, to try and take advantage of a unique market. Now, by no means does every civilian who lives in the rear areas choose to move away. Thousands actually stay. It's their home. Why should they leave? And some newcomers come in, set up businesses and so forth, because this is a unique business opportunity. You suddenly have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young men with some money. And when you were mentioning about the frustration of British soldiers with when Canadians roll through, or later Americans or even Australians, spare a thought too for the fact that the British soldier is paid a lot more than the average French soldier. So when the British start appearing on the Somme, they disrupt the French economy down there and so forth. But there's all sorts of opportunities set up. And before we actually get into the sort of opportunities that might be taken, it's worth just putting in a little caveat here. And that's that when you're taking, as a soldier, when you go out of the trenches and you do head to the rear areas, for the most of the time when you're actually in the rear areas, you're still going to be doing something. You're going to be training. You're going to be attending instructional schools about specialist weapons or about tactics or about equipment. You're going to be carrying out the dreaded fatigue duties, fetching and carrying and digging and repairing. And every soldier hates fatigue duties, especially if you've been in a period of combat as well. And even so-called rest periods, most of the time you're going to be drilling, you're going to be having troops taken out for work parties, you're going to be carrying out maintenance, and you're going to be doing a bit of training as well. So these activities that we're talking about are limited. The amount of time you as an individual soldier are going to have for these is pretty limited. But what a huge variety of things that you can actually choose. And I think that there's probably a great book waiting to be written to work out what was British soldiers' favourite activities behind the lines. And this also, when we're talking about British soldiers here, but this applies really to all the Allied soldiers, the French as well, the Belgians, the Americans when they arrived too. German experience different, and perhaps we could cover that in a separate episode. But I think perhaps the number one activity that soldiers enjoy doing, and this is just from my reading of memoirs, which I appreciate can be a little bit warped because they want to put in the fun stories, but my experience is soldiers who have a break, one of the first things they want to do is they want to get to a cafe and they want some alcohol, Dan. And I'm not sure if your reading about this maps the same.
Pretty much. I mean, there's no great surprise here, really, let's be fair. And I think there's an important backdrop that we need to include here. And it's something that I think is very powerful when it comes to that story. We have to remember where these guys are coming from and the prospect of what they're facing when they're going to leave this area, where they're going to. Now, it's one thing being 18, 19 on a trip or a holiday of some kind. And, we all kind of get that desire to go and, have a few beers in the bar in the evening. Now, if that had happened to you and I, Spence, except the previous week before, we've been shot at for the whole week and had a mate killed, maybe had a couple of near misses, kind of felt a little bit like, things have been pretty rough out there, even in not necessarily in a battle, but perhaps just in typical trench attrition, shells landed in the traverse next to you. I think if anything that's going to focus your mind into making the most of the short periods of time that you have in your life, those free periods of time, that's going to be pretty high on the list. And particularly when you're facing the prospect of knowing that next week or in 3 or 4 or 5 days' time, you're going back up that line with the possibility of never coming back down it again. All of a sudden, these precious little windows, and they are relatively few and far between, as you rightly mentioned, all of a sudden they become absolutely prime time. You really want to make the most of it. Very few soldiers are going to say, I'm just tired, I'm not going to do anything. In fact, most of the platoon, most of the section, most of the company, where possible, they're going to go out and they're going to start enjoying themselves. And as is the British way, number one of those is going to be going into a bar or a cafe, or perhaps more famously, an estaminet. Estaminet really is an old kind of pre-wartime word for a small roadside cafe that sells beer and wine and later on various other things. But also what we find, again, following that entrepreneurial spirit, is the villages and the towns behind the lines, particularly in the British sectors. If you've got a front room and you're a resident of a village like Lillers or any of these kind of little villages, Bouvry, perhaps Neuchâtel, these kind of areas, where you're behind the lines and you've got a little bit of breathing space and you've got a room that's not being used, why not turn it into a little bar? Hang a sign on your door, say, soldiers welcome, come in, grab a plate of food, get some cheap Vin Blanc, of course, famously called by the British plonk, cheap white wine, and let the lads go in and make some profit for the locals, but also give the lads a chance to spend a bit of cash. And so this time in estaminets is really popular to the extent that even the menus start to evolve. You know, those people that have frontline, you know, or areas near the front lines will start to offer things that the British Tommy just, it becomes clear that they love. Foods that we find as classic staples in Britain today: ham, egg, and chips. Absolutely classics. Really popularized in the First World War. Or bringing in rum is another one. Quite often sold by some dodgy guys in the Army Service Corps, sold to the locals, and then resold back to Tommy. All of these kind of things happen. And, you know, these lads really make the most of it, Spence. And I'm sure, like me, you've read a couple of accounts of people that have maybe got themselves in a little bit of bother as a result.
I certainly have. And just to sort of build on what you said about food, I think one thing that we're apt to forget is how good a home cooked, personally prepared meal tastes when you've been in the trenches and you've been subsisting on your yes, you get hot food, you get plenty of food. We discussed this in our food episode earlier in the series, but let's just say it's not cooked with a great deal of care. Depending on where you are in the trenches, it might be cold by the time it arrives there, and above all else, it's utterly monotonous. It's just the same thing day after day after day. And then you can go and you can have a Belgian or French housewife just prepare you a meal, and it's going to taste so much better. It's not going to be full of dirt for a start. You're guaranteed to be hot. And that taste of home, that the joy of a home cooked meal is can't be underestimated, especially during colder months where quite often the rations, or the hot rations, I should say, at the front line arrive cold. So real attraction. But as you say, Dan, wine and drink is a big thing. It's important to remember too, listeners, that in Britain before the First World War, there is not a wine drinking culture in the working class at all. Wine is a drink of the aristocracy and the middle classes. It's not a drink of the working class. And so Tommies are being exposed to wine for the first time in their lives. And compared to beer, wine is a little easier to drink. It goes down the hatch nice and easily, but it's got a higher alcohol content. And you're a Tommy who's never experienced wine before. You drink it and think, well, this is sweet. It's quite nice. Drink quite a lot. And before you know, you're blotto, and problems can emerge, whether that's getting a bit rowdy with your comrades, or indeed passing rival units, or making some inappropriate comments, particularly at waitresses, because one thing to remember is there's been such huge conscription of available manpower for the Belgians and for the French that you're unlikely to encounter waiters unless they're much older men who aren't fit to serve. You're more likely to encounter waitresses, and when you've had a few drinks, you might try out your French phrase book on some poor Belgian or French waitress who's rolling her eyes because she's heard these same lines every hour for about the last 6 months, which can sometimes cause issues. Not something interesting, listeners, not perhaps the way you might think. Sometimes these waitresses, it's alleged, have multiple soldier boyfriends because, of course, they rotate in and out, and you might not see your soldier boyfriend for 3 to 6 months. And so shall we say, the waitresses with greater tastes in men may actually be keeping 3 or 4 boyfriends on the go at the same time. Alleged, I should say. But this is widely rumoured, of course, amongst soldiers and this sort of thing. So all kinds of shenanigans can happen. And it's interesting that the Royal Military Police are always close by the bars, or behind the front lines, because this is where trouble is most likely to spark. Soldiers might swing punches at each other. They might fight amongst themselves, or fight rival units. This is a known issue as well. But one thing I think we can overestimate is the idea that there's lots and lots of fighting in these bars. At certain times, we can see that there's soldiers who come straight out of battle tend to be a lot wilder. They're full of adrenaline. They're probably um, celebrating that they're still alive and things. And tends to be when there's more trouble behind the lines. But for the most part, considering you have tens of thousands of young men in a dangerous environment with alcohol, the actual amount of trouble behind the lines is a lot lower than I think some of the memoirs would have us believe. And we can check this actually by looking at the Royal Military Police's papers that yes, there are people arrested for drunkenness, for fighting and so on regularly. But the idea that behind the lines was just one big football match with everyone punching up with each other, it's not really true. But talking about punching people, Dan, if you didn't feel like going to a cafe, perhaps you'd had a few drinks and you wanted to go and do something else, the other great entertainment behind the lines is actually sports. And I know you partake in boxing from time to time. So can you say a little bit about the importance of boxing behind the lines?
Well, yeah, I think sport generally, actually, as a whole, as you rightly say, I mean, you've got various sports that have always been key within units. Those kind of prized qualities that you would expect to find with servicemen, physical prowess being one of them, whether it's in the form of combat or any other. Boxing, there's always battalion and company boxing tournaments and inter-platoon boxing tournaments. These go on way behind the lines. They go on, of course, during in peacetime as well. And it's quite, it follows quite an obvious route. If you get platoon boxing matches where each platoon will get their best middleweight fighter, and they'll put these lads together and they'll really give them a chance to get stuck in. Of course, it's a great, if you like, there's a great opportunity for one of Britain's other favourite pastimes, or young soldiers' other favourite pastimes, which is gambling. Great thing to gamble on. Why not gamble on some lads in your company having a fight? And, if A Company's champion boxer, everybody seems to think he's doing pretty well. Maybe A Company will go and have a chat with B Company in a bit of time behind the line. Say, look, yeah, we've got a lad here we think will beat your top guy. And, there's another opportunity there. And then you do the same battalion level, and eventually you get brigade level. And then there's a divisional championship. And you might pitch a divisional champion against a certain corps. So there's this whole, if you like, this whole system that comes about particularly with boxing, but also with running, particularly distance running. That's another big one. Officers quite often partake in horse racing. So we'll see that kind of thing as well. There's any number of pastimes and kind of good sports. And I think one of the important backdrops to this as well is it's not destructive to morale. It actually increases physical ability on the battlefield. And so rather than certain pastimes, like perhaps drinking in bars, aren't necessarily promoted by the officer class and, by battalion officers and divisional level officers, things like boxing and sports and horse racing, yeah, absolutely. They're not doing any harm. Let's get the lads, if they've got a bit of spare energy, if they want to, increase their fitness, if they want to have a bit of pride in their company, absolutely, let's put on a divisional field day and we'll get the lads to play a game of football or whatever it might be. So, these are important things. And actually, we see a lot about these. To the point, Spencer, interestingly, you see football scores quite often put into regimental war diaries, which are typically reserved for things that are important in terms of the military practice of the day, what's been going on in terms of enemy activity. Quite often you'll see a whole line or even a couple of lines, B Company played C Company today and they won 3-2 in an exciting football match that took place right here. That gives you a little glimpse actually of just how important that is.
You're absolutely right. And the sporting facilities that the British Army has grow and grow and grow as the war goes on. And it's said that not far behind the line at Ypres, there are 72 separate boxing rings set up in a sort of field so you can have lots and lots of boxing matches going on at the same time. That's how popular boxing is. Hugely popular working class sport. And as you say, a great way to develop morale. Your best guy from your platoon versus their best guy from their platoon. And then the winner represents the company and the company fights the next company and so on. Massively, massively popular. Football, the same. So you have a platoon versus platoon. You have battalion, company versus company, battalion versus battalion. You have officers only games and you have men only games, or men and NCO only games as well. And it's interesting, the officers only games get big crowds from soldiers, and they actually sort of like to see the officers kick lumps out of each other. It's appealing. You're a private and you get to see that, snooty lieutenant you don't really like. Somebody goes in 2-footed on him and absolutely clatters him. There's a big cheer goes up from the crowd. And you make a great point, Dan, that sporting results, sporting outcomes are actually recorded in war diaries from time to time. People, if it's a quiet time, people write these down. People are still reminiscing about certain football matches, fights, races, there's cricket matches, there's rugby matches as well. Years after the war, if you look at regimental magazines, people still are referencing famous games that were played during the war. And the point about gambling as well, gambling is frowned upon in the British Army, and officially speaking, you're not allowed to do it. It's the sort of thing where if you are a dopey young private and you're openly gambling in front of an officer, or even worse, an RMP, Royal Military Police, you're going to get your collar felt. But it's the sort of thing that, well, it goes on. People are going to put bets down. It's going to happen. As long as it's not flagrant and it's not causing damage to morale and it's not getting people into trouble, you're allowed to do it, because it's that is an appeal as well. And that actually speaks to something too about perhaps you could have mentioned earlier, that although the British Tommy is by no means well paid, he's not rich, certainly not compared to American, Canadian, Australian soldiers, he does potentially have money burning a hole in his pocket. If he doesn't have a family back at home that he's sending money to support, then he may end up with building up spare cash, and that may encourage him into gambling too. So these sporting events, they're good natured, they're raucous, they draw huge crowds as well. Lots and lots of soldiers, if you have some free time and the fights are on or a football match is on, you're going to go and watch it, you're going to participate, you might have a little gamble as well. It's a great way to spend time, and for those participating, as you say, a great way to promote fitness, promote morale. All the armies, and this includes the Germans, to promote sport in various ways as a healthy activity compared to drinking and carousing. So it's a fundamental part of behind the lines scenes. But if you aren't a drinker, if you aren't a sportsman, if you perhaps just want a moment of quieter contemplation, there's also options for you there behind the lines too.
There are. And just before we come on to that, I want to, just because as I was talking and then as you followed up with afterwards, I thought, oh, no, really good account. Wonder if I can find it. And amazingly, during the time that you've been talking, I have found it, which never happens to me. So I might as well share it whilst we're here. But there's an important point to make here as well. And of course, that some of these sportsmen that are out there are, of course, elite athletes. You know, if you want to go and have a football match and you were, part of the 17th Middlesex Battalion, who are from memory Finchley or somewhere like that. They're made up from all walks of life. Now they might go up against the same regiment, Sportsman's Battalion, which is quite literally made up of professional sports people. So you get very high quality, very high caliber athletes out on the Western Front. And one example of this actually can be found in a battalion match played between two brigades. And the reason they do it is because on the brigade staff is a man by the name of Lieutenant Bernard Charles Jock Hartley, an old Cambridge man and England rugby international, who, because he's part of the brigade staff, gives quite an interesting account and obviously talks a lot about rugby. And he organises, in the words of one particular witness, organises a rugger match. And there's just a little account here that I want to read because I find it quite fun. This is the witness's recollections. It was between the 117th and 118th Brigades and played in sight of Ypres, but fortunately did not attract any shell fire. Jock had some difficulty in making up our team, for very few fellows knew anything about the game. In the end, he was forced to make up with some stout jocks from the Black Watch, whose knowledge of the rules, however, was very slight indeed. I was drawn in on the strength of my rugger playing when I was with the Artist Rifles. We had an appreciative crowd, most of whom, however, thought that the object of the game was to down your man at all costs, regardless of whether the ball was in his hands or many yards away. And if you continue to lay him out, all well and good. I quite like that. I think there's something quite fun about that. You can imagine some of these working class lads that don't know anything about rugby, but think as long as that guy smashes the other guy, we'll be quite content. So, there's some interesting stuff about it. But as you say, Spence, not everybody is super keen on sports. And actually, there are other opportunities. And some of these, I think, I suppose if you could look at it this way, couldn't you? If you take a cross-section of society today, not everybody's sports mad. Not everybody wants to go to the bar and have a drink. Not everybody wants to go and have a punch-up in the evening. Some people want to go and do, things that are more normal. Some people are of a less active temperament, and they're maybe a little more thoughtful about the fact that they've just escaped potential death and they'll be going in towards potential death soon. And thoughts inevitably turn to things like religion, but also the opportunity to do things that maybe have a little bit of normalcy in them, give you a little bit of a reminder of what life could have been like back in Britain at the same time. A good example, again, sort of tuning into the area of Popperinga, would be certain locations where somebody can go and just get a break from the war, an oasis, if you like. And that's actually how one particular place is really put forward as, and it's created by a reverend, a man by the name of Tubby Clayton, and he comes up with the idea of having a rank-free oasis where there's no alcohol served, but tea's served. And you can read books and you can read a newspaper and you can write letters home and you can just have a little bit of a break from the war. And that place is known as Talbot House or Toc H. And it's really something of a legend on the Western Front, Spence.
It is, and Tubby Clayton, who sets it up, is a fascinating character. And he when he's writing, he reflects on his own role. He's an army chaplain. He's Reverend Philip Clayton, always known as Tubby. And he scribbles down in 1915, "Here I am, a chaplain to the forces. I am a comic kind of creature in officer's kit. My job here is to be a friend to all." And that's really the way he approaches his religious work and also his pastoral work, to be a friend to all. And he sets up Talbot House in Popperinge, and his idea behind it is, as you've laid out, to be this sort of oasis of calm in what is a boisterous rear area town. There's a lot of drinking and there's a certain degree of chaos, especially at weekends when people have weekend passes to visit here. But Talbot House is something different, and it's modelled a little bit on the London private clubs, which are huge in the early part of the 20th century, still exist today, of course. Memberships and strict rules on conduct in there. But what makes Talbot House quite unique is it is not an officers' club. It's specifically for anybody who wants some peace and some quiet, some opportunity for reflection. And actually, the sign above Talbot House reads, "All rank abandon, ye who enter here," because it's not meant to reinforce the separation of discipline. It's meant to actually bring people together by removing rank and saying, well, we're all here. It's a place to relax. It's a place to contemplate. And it has a small but very beautiful garden that's planted with English flowers. There's a little chapel on the top floor where if you want a moment of quiet religious reflection. There's a library, there's writing desks if you want to sit and write letters. We've discussed previously, letter writing is huge. It's hugely important on the Western Front, but it's not always the easiest environment to write where you're leaning against the wall of a trench. Here you can actually use proper stationery, you're more composed, and you actually read about soldiers going to Talbot House and carrying out letter writing marathons where they want to write to everybody they know and return the mail and hopefully get some back. And it becomes, Talbot House becomes an absolutely iconic location, a real oasis of calm, not only from the sort of the confusion of this rear areas town, but also, of course, the intensity of the Western Front. And no less an authority than General Herbert Plumer, who knew a thing or two about morale, was very closely attuned to British morale, commander of British Second Army. He reflected after the war that in all my experience, I have never known a place so vital to morale as Talbot House. And he wasn't exaggerating, Dan. This really was an incredibly famous location.
Massive. And we should say actually still famous today because, of course, it is an operated museum. You can still go to Talbot House. You can still go in there, have a cup of tea. I've done it fairly recently. They'll still serve you tea. You can even stay in one of the rooms up there. You can go and visit the chapel. You can have a look around the various different areas. You can see some of the music rooms that they had. And I think one of the most powerful things actually comes in the form of the archive that they have there, which is another thing that was done. Talbot House also became a bit of a stopping point. So it might be that, Private Hill went into Talbot House one day and left a message, and you could literally leave a note on a book or on a board which says, Private Hill passed this way and he's looking to see if Corporal Jones is in the general vicinity. This is where you can find him. And so we get hundreds of thousands of these messages left throughout the Great War. And, Spence, if you were in that area and you knew that this was my kind of place to go to, you might well drop in. And somebody says, okay, well, here are the recent messages that were left, and you could look through them. And there are actually connections made for people who know that somebody is in that general vicinity. And, they'll have a chance to go and look them up. And I think the fact that those records still exist is a very powerful thing. This idea as well, Spencer, and I'd be interested to know how often it happened. But the idea is, if you've got Private John Smith and General Herbert Plumer. The idea of abandoning rank is really quite a shocking one. I wonder to what extent it actually worked in practice. Did Herbert say hello to John and they called each other Herbert and John, as one was dressed as a general and the other dressed as a private? Because of course they still keep their uniforms on. I don't know. I doubt it, but I love the idea behind it. And I love the idea that there's an honesty about Tok H, as it was known. One of the things that you could do is you could borrow a book, and in order to do that, you would leave your cap behind. And that was it. It was an honesty thing. Leave your cap. Got to come back and get your cap so you can swap it for a book. And so you get these kind of moments. But it feels like if you walk in today into Tok H, and I highly recommend that you guys do. It's an amazing place, and it feels like a little oasis. It's enclosed. It's in an area of Poppering, and Poppering was famously once described as a place of two types of building. One was a brothel, and the other was a bar. Well, Tok H is a notable exception, and in a way, the complete polar opposite to that. So for those lads that really want to go back and just have a bit of normal life, that can absolutely be done in Tok H, and I think there's a lot of charm about that. And it also plays in, I think, to an extent as well, because performances are put on there, Spencer. And perhaps one of the most popular things to do anywhere behind the lines with a free time in the Great War, and that's to take part in some kind of musical or theatrical performance, or to watch one, because that's a really big deal at the time.
It is. British music hall culture is huge before the First World War. It's absolutely huge. And the variety of music hall acts, singing, dancing, magicians, whatever you can think of, comedians, strong men, anything you can think of is likely to be on show somewhere in Britain prior to the First World War. There is a huge culture of it. It is considered a great night out for you, your family, you as an individual. There's different types of shows that you can go and see. It's cheap as well in the pre-war British society, and there's of course there's differences. There's the West End, where you're going to see the latest plays by George Bernard Shaw, but if you were to go up north and go to the northern cities, you're going to see a very different type of show, but it's going to be very, very popular. And bringing this type of show to the Western Front is an obvious step. And at first the soldiers try and put on their own shows, whether this is recreating plays, whether it's recreating music. You might have some men in your unit who can play an instrument, who can sing, who can dance, who can tell a few jokes and get the crowd going. That's popular because you get a chance to see people that you know as soldiers behaving rather differently. And it's especially popular if you've got some officers who are willing to dress up and make a slight fool of themselves. And I think this actually is a really interesting aspect, that we do think of the First World War as men with bristling moustaches ordering younger men into battle and not really caring if they get killed. But when you read about at a unit level, and this applies across armies, it's not unique to the British. You look at unit levels where they put on a play or a show or something, and quite often you'll have an officer playing the fool, even up to ranks of colonel. So the battalion colonel might come on. He won't do a huge part, but he'll come on and something funny will happen to him, bucket of water will fall on his head or something like that. And everybody will laugh. And I think it's not every officer does this, but officers who do this understand this is an important bonding experience when it's done within units. But as the war goes on, there's an opportunity to bring over civilian acts who are willing to tour and put on shows, particularly in larger rear areas and things. French touring troops also become very, very popular. Although it's interesting, there are some French touring troops who put on quite risque shows and saucy shows. That's fine for the French. They are not allowed in the British to put on for the British in case they inflame the soldiers. But these events are huge. Particularly open air events that are held in the summer, attract crowds of thousands, and people, soldiers pile in, try and watch it. And there's a great quote actually that it comes from a British nurse actually in 1916 who remembers this is a unit giving a show. Sadly, she doesn't name the unit, but she remembered she's down on the Somme, and she remembered yesterday an officer brought over some of his regiment, and they gave a variety entertainment. they were most clever. A conjurer, a musician, and a ventriloquist came. To judge from the cheering and laughing that went on, it must have been a most brilliant performance. And these concert parties, as they're called, and they come in all sorts of varieties, are immensely popular, and they are a way to sort of express, not only let out a bit of frustration with laughter, or sometimes even sadness, because they can have maudlin songs or sadder songs. It's often a chance to see your comrades in a way that you've not seen them before, dressed up and clowning around and things. So it has a morale boost in that sense as well. And these are hugely, hugely popular. So if you're not interested in the more riotous behaviors, perhaps you want something a bit more lively than Talbot House, concert parties and these sort of entertainments are absolutely always in demand, and there is a regular program. And again, just as you said about sport appearing in War Diaries, you sometimes find commentary on concert parties in War Diaries during quieter periods, which speaks to their importance and also the level of organisation that goes into them.
Huge amount of organisation. As you're talking, I'm looking at a program here from an event that took place in Bethune in Christmas of 1915. It was called Somewhere in France, after the famous phrase that was used, where specific locations weren't allowed to be mentioned. So it's called Somewhere in France, with brackets underneath saying, but really in the music hall in the Rue d'Air. And it goes on and on. It gives it a whole cast, all kinds of information. It says initial performance, Wednesday, the 22nd of December, 1915, brackets, and every evening until further notice. Doors open 5:30, commences at 6 p.m. Well, the stretcher bearers are expected to turn up at 8 p.m. onwards. So I love these kind of little quirky moments that you get. And this whole cast, I won't go through here because I'm not sure it's going to come across so well. There's some real in-jokes here for the division at the time related to this. But it says the grand cast, brackets, engaged at enormous cost, brackets, Kitchener's trade union prices, which presumably were not that high after all. But maybe we can share that on one of these things, because there's a whole cast here giving the regiment and gives a little bit of information about each one. So the key villain here, it says, is brackets, used to doing CB or confined to barracks. So lots of things. Maybe we can share that over on the Dugout. So, but you're absolutely right. These things are done with people put real pride and effort into these. And in fact, there are opportunities for particularly impressive singers or piano players or people who have a real musical turn to take on roles behind the out of the line that actually remove them a little bit from frontline service. There are guys, there's a particular singer by the name of Private Albert Hawkes I'm thinking of, who's actually taken away from an element of frontline service and put, I think, into along with the quartermasters, so that he can concentrate more on delivering performances when the rest of the battalion's out of the line. So there are any number of things that can be done there. And, concert parties and this kind of thing are absolutely key, absolutely huge. But, we have to remember, Spence, young lads in war, dangerous situation, very high risk of death. As you've already said, lots of young mademoiselles in the region. There's something that's kind of creeping around the corner on this one, and it's not always a good thing.
No, it's not. And I'd also add, it's something that the British authorities largely refuse to acknowledge, and this is prostitution. We discussed actually with James on the French Army series about that the French set up their own official brothels, and this brings a number of advantages. It ensures the safety of the ladies who are working there. If anybody lays hands on them, then that soldier can be immediately apprehended and face military justice. It ensures that the ladies are clean and are not suffering from venereal disease and so forth. The Germans do something similar as well. The British are horrified by this, absolutely think it's appalling, because officially no British soldier should have any kind of thoughts about the opposite sex unless he is married to them. And so the British refuse to acknowledge that this is going on. And there's an interesting sort of contrast, because the old army, the pre-war army, the regular army, was notorious for its interest in prostitutes, whether it was stationed in Britain or it was garrisoned somewhere around the empire. This was a known feature and so forth. But there's this sort of idea that, well, the pre-war army is rough and ready, which it is, of course. the new army, Kitchener's army, of all the volunteers, the best and the brightest of society, well, they're a different type of man. They won't do this. And of course, it's completely and utterly wrong. Wherever you're going to find large numbers of soldiers, and that's as true today as it was a century ago, you're going to find prostitutes as well. And for the British, of course, because there's no official system of this, officially you're not meant to visit a prostitute. No soldier does. It's illegal, etc., etc. That makes it very, very hard to police. And so instead, lots and lots of working ladies, French and Belgium, begin to appear and set up shop behind the lines. And unlike the French, who have a much more open view to this, the brothels that run and operate behind the lines for the British vary quite considerably from quite large ones, which are organised not dissimilarly to the brothels you'd find in big cities, in places like Paris and so forth, to quite unofficial, quite shady places as well, and inevitably soldiers and officers are going to visit them enormously. Now, in terms of where you're likely to find these brothels, having them very close to the front line is a little risky, not least because there's obviously dangers from incoming fire, but also the military police are a lot more active there. They're likely to find you and close you down and move you on. But a little bit further behind the lines, particularly at base areas, the activities that go on there are absolutely legendary. And Frank Crozier, Brigadier General, who wrote 2 hard-hitting books, probably the most hard-hitting with the title "The Men I've Killed." Fascinating character, a real firebrand, leads a fascinating life. He commented in 1915, and he was a bit of a stickler for discipline. He was a reformed alcoholic and a very, very intense man. He scribbled in his diary, "Immorality in Boulogne is as prevalent as death in the line." And places like Boulogne and Calais, they were notorious for this type of activity. You're far enough away from the front that you're not going to be in any danger. You're also far enough away from the front that the military police are thinner on the ground here. There's more reliance on civilian police. They often turn a blind eye and so forth. But I think it's hard to sort of blame young soldiers for getting involved in this. They're far from home. They don't know if the next bullet is going to have their name on it. They have excesses of testosterone. They are full of adrenaline and so forth. They are going to do what comes naturally to young men. And comment by Robert Graves, who it's often said he's a cynical observer of the war, which in some ways he is. At times he can be very perceptive, and he remembered about this. He remembered there were no restraints in France. These boys had money to spend and knew that they stood a good chance of being killed within a few weeks anyhow. They did not want to die virgins. And as much as British society is horrified by stories of this, and as much as the British military is horrified by the number of soldiers who have VD, about 400,000 British Empire soldiers will be hospitalised on the Western Front for VD in the course of the war. So that's equivalent to the casualty, or just short of the casualties, suffered at the Battle of the Somme, to put it into a wider, but British casualties at the Somme, to put it into a wider perspective. Despite this, it's almost inevitable that it was going to happen. And there are various accounts about men visiting brothels and so forth, but perhaps not as many as you might think, because it was still very much frowned upon. And although I imagine this is the kind of story that you might share at an old boys reunion in the 1920s, it's not the kind of thing you were going to share in polite society. It was still frowned upon. But given the number of soldiers hospitalized, given the number of soldiers who must have partaken of these services, it is a huge industry, and it's a huge part of what goes on in the rear areas.
And it's a huge problem as well. Being hospitalized for VD is as good as being hospitalized for a bullet in the shoulder. Does the same trick. You're not going in the front line. And in fact, the military really tried to get a grip on this in a big way, particularly, and I'm not casting dispersions on any nations here, Australians particularly susceptible and prevalent, and actually remarked for having very high VD rate, something like 25%. There are certain points in the war when 10% of the entire AIF is out of the line for VD treatment. In fact, there are VD hospitals set up in the UK, specific ones, so everybody in there is a VD patient. And this is a big deal, in the same way that trench foot and frostbite and these kind of things are. They'll take you out of the line and they'll reduce your your fighting capabilities for the army as a whole just as easy as anything else will. And so actually it really needs to be clamped down on. And maybe we do a whole episode on, probably a quite eye-watering episode, Spence, on VD at some point in the future. But things like having deterrence, and one particularly brutal one I remember reading about is having a medical unit set up outside a brothel, armed with a pretty horrific looking needle and some kind of mercurial wash that is used before and after going in to visit, is apparently a pretty effective deterrent, in that most people think it's just not worth that. So, there's all kinds of things that happen in this location, this kind of situation. But you can understand as well, there are people who, I mean, Robert Graves kind of sums it up. These guys don't want to die virgins. It's a pretty grim thought to think of for a 16, 17, 18-year-old lad who is quite literally facing the prospect of certainly imminent danger, and quite possibly imminent death as well. So that's a real concern. I think quite a sobering one in many ways.
It is, and just to add a little bit to that, we have to remember that the societal pressures at the time are very strong against this. This is really, really frowned upon. It's not something that anybody who bills themselves as respectable would do, and that applies to the working class just as much as the middle class. And the fact that, yes, of course, there's brothels in pre-war Britain, and of course there's prostitutes as well, but the fact that they are not widespread in the way that they are in wartime France indicates that the sort of changing mood. And it's a great point that these are young men; they might die any minute. Robert Graves has a point, and just to add to it too, men who go through extreme dangers and survive, it's a psychological fact that you're much more likely to engage in risky behavior once you've survived once. And so you might have survived a near miss. You might have seen your friends killed or wounded and think, well, I've got away with it. I'm going to do something, even though I'd never do that in civilian life as well. And there's the opportunity to do it. There's the pressures to do it. And as you say, Dan, unfortunately, it puts an awful lot of soldiers into hospital. And one does wonder if the authorities have been a little bit more willing to follow the French model and perhaps make it this official and go, well, okay, we don't like it, but it's part of human nature. A lot of casualties might have been saved.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating topic across the board, really. And as we get to the point of kind of winding this one up, and I think if anything, I'd like to make an appeal to you guys listening to this here, regardless of which country you call home. Do you have a little bit of a look? Because actually, if you find a veteran account, and there are them available for all nations and many very broad ranges, most of them free to find. Go on, if you get a chance, have a look or have a read back onto a soldier's memoir of life behind the lines. And any soldier's memoir will contain information and detail about that, because it played such an important part in their military experience. And I think we so often overload our thoughts and perhaps this podcast, Spence, on the frontline experience, what it was like in the trenches, in the mud, going over the top. Vast majority of soldiers, if you look at a memoir or you listen to an audio account, they're not talking for most of the time about that. They're talking about what they got up to with their mates behind the lines. And in some cases, talking about what a fun time they had in the war, in specific reference to this relatively rare free time that they get. And I don't know how you feel about this, but do you feel that sometimes we overlook, or maybe deliberately so, maybe because it doesn't sit very right given we know the casualty numbers, but we overlook this idea of people having fun and actually having positive experiences as a result of their service on the Western Front?
We absolutely do, and we've reached the stage where it's a century on. There's no living veterans of the Western Front remain, and we've become, for complex reasons, we fixate on the horrors of the Western Front, and there were horrors. We can't deny the enormous human cost, but we also, in doing this and emphasizing the horrors, we remove this entire section of life, which, as we said at the head of the episode, this is where a great deal of soldiers will spend the majority of their time, actually in rear areas. And it's fascinating to me that in the 20s and 30s, building up to the Second World War, certainly in Britain, there are plays that are set behind the lines. There's films that are sort of knockabout and set behind the lines. Lots and lots of memoirs will dwell at length about life behind the lines and misadventures and characters and so forth. A lot of early battlefield tourism, which we've discussed before, is driven. Yes, people go and look at the old front line, but what they really like to do is go and drink in the old boozers that they drunk in during the actual war and sort of reconnect with this. And the idea that the war was fun, perhaps we can overestimate, which I'm not sure too many people thought the war was fun, but we must not neglect that there was fun within the context of the war. And that's a strange concept for us to grapple with, I think, because we're so used to the idea of all the horrors of the war, the mud, the blood, the trenches, the barbed wire, and so forth. But there was still opportunity for young men to have fun. And the men who survived the war, what they tended to remember, as we all do, nostalgia has a way of removing the bad and emphasizing the good. They remembered the good times with their mates. They remembered the sporting events, the concert parties, the drinking. Maybe they remembered their trips to the brothel, although they perhaps didn't talk about them, except in private company. But that's what they tended to remember. Now, not all soldiers. Of course, there's going to be soldiers who were terribly mentally scarred by the war and so forth. But for many soldiers, it was that aspect that they would revisit and which kept them in their old comrades associations for decades after the war to share these stories. And this is a part of the First World War, which you said right at the start, Dan, it's a part we're so apt to forget. If you think of the First World War, we don't think of places like Talbot House. We don't think of concert parties and so forth. We think of the fighting. And yet, in fact, it's an essential part of the wartime experience.
Well, there we are, ladies and gents. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Hope you found it interesting. I certainly have. I always love talking about that kind of thing. And I just want to finish with a big thank you to you guys that have come over and joined us on our separate break-off area, the Dugout, which is our platform over on Fourth Wall. It's where we kind of continue the conversation. It's a little bit more informal. We like to have a chat. In fact, we're just off there to do another episode right now, which is going to continue on the theme of life behind the lines and some of the kind of experiences that we've picked up through battlefield touring and reading memoirs and this kind of thing. So we're going to go and have a chat about that now. If you haven't already tried it, please do. Head over there now. You can get an entire month completely free at the rank of captain. Gives you access to a load of extra content, and there's a great community of people who also love history over there as well. So if you haven't tried it, do check it out. We'll put the links in the description down below so you can follow that as a result of this episode. Apart from that, thank you ever so much. We'll see you again next time. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. I'm just thinking, actually, did we just do a whole episode without any edits in it?
Yeah, we did.
Wow,
hey, we
that's
did.
rare.
There we go.
Hey, yeah, use this as the outtake so that people can actually prove that occasionally we do that. That's quite impressive.
That's 80 episodes down. We've finally done a one
finally
take.
nailed one. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, there we go. Brilliant.